the floor show, I'm not quite sure which one. I'm the opening act, or possibly the floor show, I'm not quite sure which one. We have the distinct privilege of having Linus Torvalds with us. It's a Q&A session. I would like to put the emphasis on the queue, so form an orderly queue if you'd like to ask something, because I will not talk to you if you don't. Actually, DKG over here is doing the actual question moderation. And I suppose, without further ado, welcome Linus.
So apparently there are absolutely no questions. That's fine. We'll cut it short. Just out of interest, how many of people are local here? I just want to know. Okay, so not too many, because I did a Q&A a few months ago at the local Portland Linux Unix users group. So I was hoping there were new people here, which there apparently is. I don't do speeches. I hate doing public speaking, just so I don't know what you're interested in. So it is a Q&A or it's nothing.
I'll start with something non-controversial.
No, I'm fine with controversial. That's not usually my problem. Yeah.
It's well known around these parts that in 2007 you did an interview where you said that although you've used many Linux distributions, you had never used Debian because you found it difficult to install.
Yes.
Have you tried it since?
No. That was quick. I'm sure it's gotten much easier to install. To me, a distribution is, I'm sorry, you may want to close your ears now. A distribution is not very interesting. I want it to be easy to install so that I can just get on with my life, right? Which is mostly the kernel. The closest I got to installing Debian was there was one machine, I forget which one it was. It may have been the MacBook Air that actually had trouble installing something. And Debian, the installer would boot, but then it didn't install there either. And eventually I figured out what was the problem with that machine, but by then it was too late. I have tried Ubuntu, and that got nixed really fast because they made it really hard for me to install my own kernel. And when make install doesn't work for me, I'm like, whatever, I'll do something else then, right? So somebody should check that you can just do make install and you don't have to build a package and install a package, right? Because if I have to install a package, at that point the distribution gets in my way, and at that point I'm saying, okay, I'll do something else instead. Okay.
If there's a way to break installing an operating system, I've found it multiple times, and if there isn't one you already know of, I found it. And Debian, last time, super easy. Highly recommended trying.
Maybe I should try. I mean, one of the problems I have is I am not an MIS person. I mean, I may do kernels, and people think that that means that I'm technical. But when it comes to actually maintaining machines, I am a complete disaster, right? I change my own machines regularly, so changing the system I run on my machine would be easy, right? I end up upgrading machines a couple of times a year usually, but I end up having also to maintain my family's machines. And that ends up being the one that I don't upgrade my family's machines very often, and I don't want to run multiple different distributions across different machines because I suck at MIS. So it ends up being, for me, a distribution is something very sticky. Once I started with one thing, I have a really hard time just doing something else because that means I have to switch over all my kids' machines, my wife's machine, and that's just painful. So that's why.
Okay, so this is a little difficult. I guess we're all, at least for me, I'm kind of wondering very much like I think you are lately, how to get to the year of the Linux desktop, if you will, right?
Wow.
All right, and we'd all like it to be the year of the Debian desktop if possible, and I'm trying to figure out, if anything, if you have any insight as to possibly how to get closer or towards that, if anything.
So, I mean, there's a lot of things that are getting closer to that, and I think, I mean, technical people don't tend to use Chromebooks, but I think that Chromebooks are the kind of thing that will make the year of the desktop more possible, right? Because once people get used to running their applications basically as a browser, that makes a lot of things much easier. That said, let me go on my first rant of the evening, right? One of the problems desktop has, I mean, ignoring all the purely market and getting pre-installs and making it just so that normal people, and by normal people I mean obviously non-technical people, will just buy a machine and it just works. One of the things that none of the distributions have ever gotten right is application packaging, right? And now somebody will say, hey, dpackage is way improved and much better than RPM, and that's not at all what I'm talking about. I'm talking about actual application writers that want to make a package of their application for Linux. And I've seen this firsthand with the other project I've been involved with, which is my divelog application, right? We make binaries for Windows and OS X. We basically don't make binaries for Linux. Why? Because making binaries for Linux desktop applications is a major fucking pain in the ass, right? You don't make binaries for Linux. You make binaries for Fedora 19, Fedora 20, maybe there's even like RHEL 5 from 10 years ago. You make binaries for Debian Stable. Well, actually, you don't make binaries for Debian Stable because Debian Stable has libraries that are so old that anything that was built in the last century doesn't work, right? But you might make binaries available for Debian, whatever the code name is for unstable. And even that is a major pain because, Christ, we had this small local flame fest just a couple of days ago. Debian has these rules that you're supposed to use shared libraries, right? And if you don't use shared libraries, getting your package in, is just painful. But using shared libraries is not an option when the libraries are experimental and the libraries are used by 2 people and one of them is crazy. So every other day, some ABI breaks, right? So you actually want to just compile one binary and have it work, preferably forever, and preferably across all the Linux distributions. And I actually think distributions have done a horribly, horribly bad job. One of the things that I do in the kernel, and I have to fight this every single release, and I think it's sad, we have one rule in the kernel. There is one rule. We don't break user space. Everything else is kind of a guideline. The whole security thing, it's a guideline that we shouldn't do stupid shit, right? But that's not a hard rule. People do stupid shit all the time. I don't get that upset. People break user space. I get really, really angry. I mean, this is something that is religious for me. You do not break user space. And even in the kernel, every single release, I have people saying, okay, I'm changing this ABI because it's cleaning stuff up. And I'm like, no, you're not changing that ABI because I will crush you, right? And actually, it's often okay to change ABI as long as nobody notices. But immediately when somebody notices, it's a bad thing. And this is like a big deal for the kernel. And I spend a lot of effort explaining to all the developers that this is a really, really important thing. And then all the distributions come in and they screw it all up because they break binary compatibility left and right. They update glibc and everything breaks. Hey, you can recompile everything, right? That really seems to be this mindset quite often. It's like, the glibc people say, it was a bug, look, here's the standard. It says you can't rely on that. Nobody cares. If it's a bug that people rely on, it's not a bug, it's a feature, right? And I won't even get into all the other libraries, but it's really sad when the most core library in the whole system is okay with breaking stuff. And as long as things improve and they fix the ABI. So that's my rant, and that's what I really fundamentally think needs to change for Linux to work on the desktop, because you can't have application writers do 15 billion different versions. And I'm on record as saying that maybe Valve will actually save the Linux desktop. And it's actually not because I think games are important. I don't care, I don't play games. I think some people do, so games may be important. But the really important issue is, I guarantee you, Valve will not make 15 different binaries. And I also guarantee you that every single desktop distribution will care about Valve binaries. So the problem is, Valve will build everything statically linked and create huge binaries, and that's kind of sad. But it's what you have to do right now. Sorry about the rant.
This isn't a question for Linus. I just wanted to, this should have actually been something that was relayed to the audience at the beginning of the talk, and I'm terribly sorry that I didn't do this. It's my fault. Due to the nature of this session, there may be coarse language involved. If you are sensitive to coarse language, I invite you to step out with me and we can discuss it. Thank you.
I'm sorry. I didn't read the guidelines. I guess I should. They sent me the guidelines, so you can't really blame the organizers. It's my fault.
What version of GCC do you think we should ship in the next version of Debian?
Well, we fixed the particular problem we had with the particular version of GCC you already shipped, so you're fine. You're off the hook. There's still some discussion. All the discussion seems to have mostly died down, that the way the kernel fixed the GCC bug, and realistically, almost nobody else is going to be impacted by that bug, because you need to have inline assembly, and very few projects do that. The way we did it in the kernel was kind of a big hammer approach, and some people were a bit upset about that, but it does mean that any version of GCC that is more recent than, let's say, 4.2 is probably fine.
I have an incredibly boring technical question. I recently saw that there was another patch for proposal of revoke getting implemented. So have you had a look at this yet?
I haven't had time to look at the patch. I looked at some of the very core infrastructure for it, the whole counting thing that it used. And it's probably going to happen. One thing that I was happy about was that one of the comments was that this might end up being generic enough that we can use the same thing that we basically use for sysfs, which kind of has the same issue anyway. I mean, we have a lot of our own internal things that can be revoked already. It's just that it's not exposed generically for any file descriptor. It's going to be painful. I mean, it's, there's no question about that. And at the same time, people have been asking about revoke for a long, long time. So it's going to get done. I'm not going to say it's next version. It's probably going to be some discussion before it goes in.
Thank you.
Hi. I'm sorry to ask this question almost, but it's something that I think is a little bit important. How do you think it affects the culture of a community of a project when the leader is on that project's public mailing list telling people in response to patch reviews that they should be retroactively aborted.
Right.
And maybe that you're surprised that they're still alive because they should have starved to death when they were children because they were too stupid to find a pit to suck on.
I agree that some people might be put off by that. But on the other hand, you know what? In the end, I don't care, right? I care about technology, and I've actually seen projects that took the whole political correctness so far that the project no longer is about the technology. Wow. We're getting more questions, I think. At some point, we might want to moderate them. So my take, don't get me, I'm very happy to talk about this. It's not a problem for me. My standpoint has always been that, hey, people are different. I'm abrasive. I grew up in a culture that I think is not quite as politically correct as the culture, especially in the US today. I also grew up in a family that was largely dysfunctional. So, so people are different, and some people take offense, and some people give offense, and we all have to live together, but the living together is not by finding some lowest common denominator. The living together, and it has actually been fairly successful, is to realize that, hey, unlike your family, you can actually pick your friends, and you can pick the coworkers, and open source is actually really good at that. Better so than many commercial software projects, because in a commercial setting, you're kind of stuck with your boss. In open source, find people you like. Find people you like working with. I work directly with, let's say, 20 people closely and 50 people more or less, right? Every release, there's 1,000 people involved. Find somebody you like better than me. That's fine, right? I'm not willing to be less honest because I know I'm abrasive, right? And quite often the whole, like when I say something like, I wonder how he grew to be an adult when he's so stupid that I don't expect him to find food. Some people might realize that it's kind of hyperbole and jokey.
I'm not saying something bad that, it's not politically correct or whatever, although certainly I would understand if people do say this. It's more about treating other people with respect and maybe saying technical.
You know what? I mean, you can applaud everything you want, but I don't respect people unless I think they deserve the respect. There are people who think that respect is something that should be given. And I happen to be one of the people who am perfectly happy saying, no, respect should be earned. And without being earned, you don't get it, right? It's really that simple. And not everybody agrees, and that's fine too, right? There are people I refuse to work with, right? It cuts both ways, and I realize that, right?
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Good evening. So System D.
Wow.
It uses technology exposed by the kernel, the Linux kernel, that is not, exposed by other kernels. It's a user space thing. Are you happy about System D using Linux-only technology? Do you not care since it's user space? And a follow-up, what's your opinion about PID1?
Wow. I don't think PID1 is that as special, right? And I actually think Systemd does a lot of things right. The problem I've had with Systemd has been, there are a few, literally, before Systemd really got started, this must be one of the kernel summits, and I'd like to say 5 years ago, but that's a number completely made up, right? Leonard was giving a talk about UUIDs to the kernel people at the kernel summit. And we laughed him out of the room, right? UUIDs are crazy shit. They're up there with XML as bad ideas, right? and exposing them as something really cool and clever was, I felt, just stupid, and I wasn't the only one. At the same time, there's no question that the Unix init system is not wonderful, right? And it wasn't being very actively maintained. And systemd gives a lot of features that you really couldn't get any other way. The boot up speed ups are real, right? And it's not saying that you couldn't get the same things with non-systemd, but systemd stepped up and did it, right? So I think the fight mostly is over. The lack of portability is sad. The thing that I absolutely hate is that the bug reports have been basically ignored in some cases, and I don't like that. But is there really much discussion left? Maybe. I mean, I thought Debian already basically decided to go with systemd, but apparently I may have heard just one side of the story, right? I realized people expected me to hate systemd. I don't hate it, really. I mean, I think it's somewhat interesting and it has quirks, but what does not, right?
Okay, thank you.
So you mentioned desktops and distros as being something that more or less you want it to not get in your way or make your life more difficult or add overhead. Yeah. Things like make install, for example. What are the top couple of ways that a distribution like Debian could make your life personally or professionally easier, actually be a positive influence above just having Linux and a bunch of software?
So my personal Linux use is actually pitiful. I've shown what my desktop looks like, and the universal response is, that's it, right? I have a web browser and 3 terminal windows open, and that's pretty much it. I have no need for a distro to do anything fancy for my own case. Like I use make, GCC, bash, and xterm, or gterm, or anything. I don't even care which terminal, right? The thing that would make my life easier, and that I've sometimes heard like ranting about, is it's sometimes annoying. I mean, my family runs Linux, obviously. They've been running Linux for a long time. I have no trouble with Linux, but I was ranting not that long ago about how setting the time zone or connecting to a new wireless printer was unnecessarily hard and required privileges that my kids should not need to have, even though clearly when they go to school, they need to be able to connect to the school printer. And the solution is not that I, as a system administrator, go to the school and install that printer, right? The solution was, at that point, to just say, okay, kids, you can be admins and whatever, here's the root password in the case of one of them, and the other ones, I just made admins so that they wrote their own password. But that was to me annoyance, and it was an unnecessary annoyance, right? And that's, so I would like distributions to really concentrate on making it easy for normal people, because that way I don't have to maintain the machines so much.
Thanks.
By the way, I would like to point out that both of my complaints actually did get fixed. At least the time zone thing on the distro I do use, you can now set whatever time zone you want, and it never complains. Of course, it crashes if you set the time zone to be the automatic network time, and the network goes away, but that's not a distro bug, that was a GNOME bug.
Hi. You may remember a few years ago at an event in Cambridge, you probably don't. We gave you a Debian t-shirt. I hope you appreciated it, and it's seen appropriate use. I have a question. What happens, cast your mind a few years forwards from now, one of your kids comes to you and says, Daddy, I want to be a kernel hacker. What are you going to say to them?
I'm going to say, hallelujah, because it's not going to happen, right? I have never pushed I want my kids to get an education, and my wife claims I push them, but I have never pushed them into computer science. And I kind of hope, because I think it's a great education, I think it's a great way to get a job, I think it's just a wonderful area to be in, so I hope that they decide to look at it. But so far, there is absolutely zero interest, and I don't see it happening, so. Yeah, I'd love for them to be kernel developers, but I may have to adopt.
Hi. In discussion to further the conversation about subsurface, I have a half-troll, half-serious question, which is, have you considered circumventing distributions entirely and distributing subsurface as something that runs inside a Linux container using LXC or Docker or something like that?
I haven't, and I have to admit that I'm not even the maintainer of subsurface anymore. I started the project, and like most smart people, I just pushed it off to somebody else who was willing to take it. It has been talked about. It's not something Subsurface will do on its own, but there are projects that apparently have realized that this is a problem, and there's been noises about making the whole Docker container work as a way to install application packages sanely, securely, and in an environment that is limited, or maybe not limited is the right word, but in a standardized environment so that you can do things like upgrade your system and not break your applications. So I'm actually hopeful that there are people who are looking at this. Subsurface is a small project with basically a handful of developers, which is actually true of most of them. You probably know, all of you work on small projects with a handful of developers. It means that those kinds of projects don't